Hello, and welcome to another episode of the magical world of G. Michael Vasey. This is G. Michael Vasey speaking, and today I'm very pleased to be talking to a special guest, Stephen Tanham. Steve is a founder of the Silent Eye Mystery School. He describes himself as a mystical teacher, writer, poet, and prolific photographer. He is the founding director of the Silent Eye School of Consciousness, a not-for-profit, international distance learning organization that provides a mentored path to deep and practical spiritual consciousness. Steve's spiritual path to the Silent Eye includes growing up in a Rosicrucian family and rising to become the leader of the local affiliated body, then regional monitor, and finally Grand Counsellor for the north of England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. We talked through his history in mysticism and magic, and I met Steve several years ago at the Servants of the Light, another school of magic. I've known Steve ever since, and I've spent some time with him and his associates with his new school, and enjoyed it very much. Please welcome Steve Tanham.
I have to be qualified about the word magic, because I had nothing but suspicion for magic for probably the first 20 years of my mystical life. I viewed myself, and still do, as primarily a mystic. So my interest is in experiencing and in teaching the mystical life and that which triggers it. Magic I was suspicious of because of what became an enduring trait, and not necessarily a likable trait, as Sue will tell you, of disliking and mistrusting fluff. I'm sure she's mentioned this many times in your discussions about the origin of the Silent Eye, but I'm very wary of the effect of fluffy practices on people, particularly new people. And to me, magic seemed to be at that stage full of soft notions, imprecise decisions, and things that fed the ego. I mean, let's get right to the heart of it. Things that fed the ego rather than fed the journey to the soul.
What would your definition of magic versus mystical be?
And bear in mind, I'm starting this by going back to how I used to feel. So to me, back in those days, and we're talking probably 25 years ago, the mystical was a somewhat selfless and a very direct route to a personal experience of higher being, whereas magic had all sorts of trappings which were dangerous fodder to the ego. That, I think I see that as primarily. So there was a lot of self-aggrandizement that went with magic. And the people I really respected were the ones who would not choose to stand out in a crowd, who were quite quiet and often very humble people. But when you were with them, they had a magnetism and they had a presence, and they almost shone in the beauty of what they had experienced and of what they sought to teach.
Was there a religious background in your life that influenced this perception?
So I had a very clear upbringing. I was hated by the church in the local village, to the extent that they fouled up my 11 plus, and I was sent to a secondary modern, and it was later exposed by the governors of the school just what the headmaster had done. And the reason that came about was I had very liberal parents who were Rosicrucians, and they brought me up in the Rosicrucian tradition, though not with any severity of force. It was there if I was interested. It was a choice, and I could leave it at any time I wanted to. It was a beautiful background for that kind of upbringing. So I became what was known as a junior order of torchbearers member, because the Rosicrucians in those days were a very effective worldwide school of mysticism. They taught by correspondence course. You probably know.
Yes, it was the first school that I ever applied to when I was about 16.
Right.
And of course, they wrote a nice letter back saying a bit of life experience might be good first.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I suspect I benefited from being the child of a family who were already Rosicrucians. In fact, my father was one of the first local masters of the chapter in Manchester. And somewhere in my possession, I have a silver naming mug with my name on, which was inscribed back in 1954, the year I was born. So there was a very special family attachment to it. And certainly in the first part of my life, I did my very best to honour that. And I greatly enjoyed it, I have to say. I greatly enjoyed it. It was a very precise organisation. It taught beautifully. It had very interesting gatherings. But like any organisation, it suffered eventually from time, and it suffered from a huge split within the organisation. It was my first exposure to what egoic forces could do to enlightened organisations, and that became a very big part of my psyche. That there was a demon force lurking in there, which was in all of us, very very Jungian this, and it was lurking in all of us, and it could erupt at any time if the balance of the individual was upset by personal ambition. Anyway, from an early childhood onward, I can remember sitting in my parents' bedroom with my own little altar or sanctum, as they called it, beautifully dressed with a purple cloth and a couple of candles and a mirror, that most effective of spiritual teachers, a mirror. And going through the early lessons, I can still remember the early invocations of those lessons. So it formed a beautiful and very deep early background. But of course, going back to my story, the local church, because my parents were not very worldly wise, and so the vicar came around one day and, probably foolishly, looking back on it, they told him all about it and how about their mystical ambitions and for their son, etc. So, to cut a long story short, we became persona non grata as a family in terms of the church, and the deadly embrace of the headmaster and the local vicar did their very best to spoil my life.
So from the Rosicrucian childhood to where next?
I kept on with that. I did rise to become master of the local lodge, the local chapter. It wasn't called a lodge; it wasn't big enough, but the local chapter. So I did that, and that was really the high point from my father's point of view of everything I'd done, and he was extremely proud of that. And then we had the children, and then things got complicated with career and everything, and it was all going well, but it was taking up a huge amount of time. So I had about 10 years when I didn't do very much mystically. I still counted myself a Rosicrucian. But then one day I realized I was headed for the millennium, and I didn't belong to any of these things, and I didn't belong to the thing I had loved the most, which was Amorc, the Rosicrucian order. Yeah. So I just wrote to them. I said, look, I'm terribly sorry about this, but this is who I am, and I did a lot 10 years ago, and I would like to come back. But there's only a few months. Can I rejoin? Because I really wanted to be in there for the turn of the century. And they did. They'd had it was just after they'd had the terrible splits with Gary Stewart, and the traditional Amorc, which is the one I went back to, didn't even have data records. They had one tape smuggled out of San Jose on the Friday afternoon before the whole thing closed, and that tape was used by the English Grand Master, as he was called, Sven Johansson, great man. And he had IT training, and he managed to rebuild the database and then siphon off the UK and its affiliate members, and was able to gradually put together the organisation. But that's how desperate the situation had become. So I joined him, basically, and he was very interested in my past. And I was kind of fast-tracked. But the other reason for being fast-tracked through it was that I had an office. So by then, I'd set up a software company called Insider Technologies. And there I was joining the Rosicrucians nearly 10 years after this. So I was 10 years into the company. So I had the time to go back to my first love, which was mysticism, and rejoin the Rosicrucians. But by then I had a nice office. We had a nice office on Salford Quays in Manchester. And so I offered the use of that office to Amorc as a meeting place for the Manchester chapter. And Sven was delighted, and he used to come up quite frequently. And we did some work on the database stuff for Amorc, and our friendship grew, really. So that was that stage of it. And I became the master of the chapter, and then I became something called the regional monitor, which looked after several of the chapters in a geographic area. And then I was promoted up to Grand Councillor. So I was one of 2 Grand Councillors in the UK, running the North of England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And that was quite a job. And as you know from these
I can imagine.
The majority of the work is administrative. So
yes,
as a level of service, it can be crippling, but you do it because it's what you love and it's the right thing to do.
How on earth do you get from there to where we met, which was SOL?
Yes. So at the height of my presence within Amorc as it stood then, and it was still very weakened compared to what it had been, I discovered the Qabalah, the Tree of Life, and I thought, well, and it was part of the Rosicrucians had a special subset which taught the Qabalah, and I thought this was really interesting. For the first time, I felt a connection with a magical presence, if you like. I felt this quite deeply, and I was also usually very at home, to be honest, with Hebrew and Jewish ideas. There was a certain warmth and respect that kind of generated itself in my being whenever I studied these things. So I thought that's really interesting. So at the time, we used to go on holiday to Jersey. We we'd loved going to Jersey. The kids loved it. So a group of 4 families used to go every July to Jersey. And occasionally I would go into St. Helier, and I didn't think of Jersey at all as a spiritual island. I just thought it was a beautiful place. And occasionally I would go into St. Helier and just walk. And I would walk through the streets. I'd just get half a day to myself, and the kids would be okay and perfectly happy back at the hotel in the pool with Jill. And I would just walk through the back end of St. Helier, and my thoughts were, somewhere here, I know there is someone deeply spiritual. And don't ask me how I knew that. I had no idea. I just knew that somewhere in this ostensibly very physical, very commercial, island holiday-based world, there was somebody. And it was a most irrational feeling. And then the year after, I discovered there was a lady called Dolores Ashcroft-Nowitzki. And I think I was feeling full of confidence at the time. And her address was on the back of one of the books. Or you could contact her via one of the back. And I think it was the Shining Paths that I picked up, first of all. Because I had never done really any pathworking. Amorc didn't do pathworking as such. And so I started to read this book. I was absolutely fascinated that one could have subjective experiences with objective connections by walking the paths of the Tree of Life. And I thought that was absolutely wonderful. And that book of hers was absolutely fantastic. So I wrote to her. I said, it's a bit cheeky, but this is who I am, and I'm a Grand Councillor of Amorc. And we're coming again in July to St. Helier, and I would really love to meet you. Could we have lunch? I thought, there's a good chance if she's old school, she'll just slap that down as being disrespectful, but because she wasn't, and she didn't. So I got to the hotel, and there waiting for me was an invitation to go and have lunch with them, and a complete copy of the Soul Course on CDs. So they had given me it because of the work I had been doing at Amorc. So, and I was just, completely overwhelmed. So I went to lunch and I met the 2 of them. So that was quite a meeting, really. And I got on straight away. They didn't particularly expect to get anything from me, but right away I was interested in what I could do. And it didn't take long talking to them to realize they were facing enormous challenges from an administrative point of view. So I went back home and thought about what I could do, and had several emails with Dolores and said, I think I really helped this, and I'm also interested in being a student and learning to a deeper level the Western mystery tradition. That was my key phrase. I felt I didn't really understand the Western mystery tradition. So she put me in touch with a few local people, and I wanted to really get into this. But it was obvious she was desperate for help, because Michael, it later transpired, I think had dementia even at that stage, and was facing enormous difficulty in keeping things open. So I said, well, let me work with you at the administrative level, And so I began to field a lot of the correspondence she was getting about missing orders for lessons and things. And then I realized the depth of the problems. One weekend, I created Sol's website, and it went live, I think, on the Sunday evening. She phoned me up and said it was, she'd seen it, and it was wonderful that they had a presence. They didn't have an administrative presence on it, but at least it was something we could add to. And then I managed to spec out how we could use PayPal, because the key was payment. Michael hated PayPal. He absolutely loathed PayPal. So it took me a further 6 months, I think, to convince him that the only way I could administer it without a much larger staff than we had was to be able to use that kind of payment. And then we manually sent out as a PDF the lesson. So I had this ready to roll. They invited me to an administrative meeting. There were other people working with me at that point. There was Brian O'Neill, for example, and he was absolutely fantastic. And other people were there as well, but Brian was my main partner in it. So within a few months then, we had it live, and it went live worldwide. So we could send to anybody, given that they sent us a payment, we could send the lessons out as a PDF, because that revived Sol. And then we began to work on the admission systems, because there was no queuing mechanism for the admission systems. So anybody processing admissions was being constantly overwhelmed. The whole thing was a big success, and it was a big success very quickly. So I suggested to Dolores that we set up a resource council whose job was not to manage Sol, because she was very sensitive about that, but whose job was to manage the administration of Sol, leaving her and Michael to set the goals. And that's what we did. So,
but this whole period, you were also being exposed to something a little bit different, right? And how was your reaction to that? Because it sounded like, as a younger person, you would have been a little bit suspicious about this.
I think I would. I mean, I was fairly reactionary. Don't forget, I had a very bad experience with the village and the school, so I had a certain attitude to authority. So I was suspicious, but it became obvious very quickly that Dolores was the real thing. She could be, heaven knows, she could be temperamental, but can't we all? I say that in the full knowledge that I can also be temperamental. So I learned an awful lot from her, and it was lovely. We were deep friends, really. I mean, she was looking for eventual succession, but she didn't really want to let go, and there was no pressure from me to let go. I just kept on, really. I just kept on doing what I was doing.
So at some point, obviously, you grew dissatisfied or uncomfortable with what was going on. How did you get from SOL to deciding to create a school of your own, Silent Eye?
Right. Well, before I met up with Dolores, I had started to read the works of a fascinating man called Gurdjieff. And I have never been so struck by the truth or the power of a philosophy as I was by his work, and Ouspensky's rendering of his work as well. In fact, most of us, I think, were exposed to what subsequently became the Fourth Way by the work of Ouspensky, because it was so beautifully described by that genius, a very difficult man, but a genius. And so really, even when I met Dolores, I said, I'd love to understand the Western mystery tradition, but I'm basically passing through on my way to a Fourth Way school. And yes. She laughed, really. She thought that was great. And I think that was why they were interested in just enabling me to understand from an academic point of view. But then I began to get really interested, and more than that, I liked them. I really liked them. And I wanted to help. I recognized that I had been put there, and I do believe in fate very strongly. I recognized I'd been put in that position to help those two people and their organization, which I think, to be honest, and I don't mean this just about me, but without that level of help, then Sol wouldn't have continued at that point.
I don't know what sort of time period that was, but I got exposed to Sol, and I found it quite well organized by the time I got into it. So I think I probably was one of the people that benefited from all of that activity.
Yeah. Well, I hope so, and it gives me a lot of pleasure. Most people who I meet still refer to how effective that time was. And the other thing was they said that it had changed things because it had taken all the pressure off Dolores and Michael, who, really was losing his memory more and more at that stage. So he could administer the goals and the big stuff, but he couldn't keep the details. So I used to do all the accounting, and he was an accountant, and I used to send him a monthly summary, and he would sign it and send it back. It was wonderful stuff, and he loved it. So he was very happy with it. So I managed a difficult balancing act. And I didn't drop the ball, and it was quite a ball on occasions. It was full of life, and managing it took all the skills I'd learned in the other parts of my life. But then I got to a point, and I don't want to go into too many details, but that point itself really produced the next stage, because there were so many egoic interactions going on at that point in Sol's life. There was so much talk and dispute of succession, and I don't think we had too much in common apart from human beings in our past in terms of what we were trying to do at that stage. So there was a degree of suspected incompatibility in that I was no longer intent on producing a Sol-like entity.
I could see this happening. I mean, as a sort of outsider, yes, or a semi-insider, but I could see this.
And I just didn't want to be in that grinding machine. So I think I had an unfortunate conversation with Dolores where I referred to the succession as a poison chalice, which looking back on it wasn't the nicest thing to say. But and it wasn't said with emotion, and it was more said, and it was said with irony and humour. So, but it was probably the wrong thing to say. And she was, and I imagine is, a very sensitive person. The words weren't the right words, and they didn't sit well. So I think from then on, my card was marked, but it didn't really matter. I continued to administer, and I ended up handing over to Stephen Critchley after I'd shown him how to run all the systems.
At some point, you were definitely of the mind that you were going to set up the Silent Eye, yes, and you had good reason for that, as you've described. And I never got the impression. Well, so you'd helped administratively and in other ways with the school as far as you felt you could go, and you still had this fourth way objective. So let's go from that sort of thing.
Yes, and it wasn't entirely fourth way, because what I had absolutely loved learning from Dolores was ritual. Really loved it. And she was, knowing what I wanted to do, I had removed myself from these politics of succession, although they had not removed themselves from me.
Yeah.
And that remained one of the strongest drivers to set up the Silent Eye in the way we did, because I didn't want it to be just a fourth way. And at school, there was lots of resistance, because I'm not sure that Sue was keen on it being too much of a fourth way school. She was very into ritual. She was very into Western mystery tradition of a sort. But she agreed with me that the excesses were undesirable, and there was an awful lot of fluff. But she used to make the point that, a lot of people who needed what we were going to be doing came to us through the world of fluff. And and that's the sort of wisdom that she has. And it can be downright annoying at times. So I wanted a mixture, and there was just me to start with. I left Sol one sad morning, and a few people phoned up and said, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "I have absolutely no idea, except that these are the goals, and I'm going to take a few months to think about what to do." And what I managed to do was to, after a few months, I managed to persuade Sue to come and join us, to join me, really. And so the two of us then began to take the ideas I had drafted out and to start to put a framework around them and decide how we would birth the organisation, which we did in 2013 at the Nightingale Centre with the Song of the Troubadour was our foundation workshop.
What are your objectives for the Silent Eye? What is it that you think differentiates it? What does it bring to the students? And where do you want it to go?
Well, I think the honest answer to that is really any organisation just brings the qualities of the people. So, it brings the chemistry. In our case, it brings the chemistry of three of us. But we have strong contacts as well. There are other people working with us on different levels who are in organisations that are very sympathetic, and we to them, that kind of thing. Diana Young is one of those people, and Diana is a fundamentally pivotal person in my experience and in my latter learning. I have to say, hugely so, really. Probably more so than Dolores, but the two of them viewed it that they were working together. I mean, Diana and Dolores are incredibly good friends, but they viewed it that Dolores had handed me over to Diana for the next stage, really, which was a very beautiful thing. And I only found that out later on because they knew there was a lot of sensitivity at that point, because it's a difficult thing to go through to leave something and then found something else, which is then seen in however mild a fashion is seen as the opponent, not necessarily the enemy. It is seen as the opponent.
How would you describe the silent eye if you were talking to a prospective student? How would you differentiate the silent eye against, say, SOL or the Golden Dawn or Rosicrucians?
This is, I think, where the troubadour idea came from. It's a travelling space of gentle and mystically intimate conversation with students, and that space travels within a series of 3 maps of the human psyche, both psychological and spiritual. And it travels from the ordinary faces of the ego, the ordinary me, the self, the lower self, if you like, through 2 more levels that take us all back to the facets, the very facets themselves of being. And to do that, we use a map based upon the Enneagram, although we use it in our own way. I mean, somebody who is an Enneagram purist in Gurdjieff's time would recognize it, but they wouldn't necessarily recognize the other uses that we put it to. So we use it to map the 9 faces of egoic mankind and womankind. And we take people very carefully. We usually only have a handful of students each because it's very intensive, and it takes an awful lot of time. I mean, one of my students, and we like to use the word companion, not students, but one of my companions sends me 2,000 words each week, and she's fabulous. She's just you couldn't wish for a better student companion. But responding to 2,000 very well thought out words takes up a fair chunk of a day.
I can imagine, yeah.
And that's just one student. So we probably, as we are, can't sustain more than a handful of those students each. But we have this wonderful travelling troupe of people who like to come to both our weekends and our annual event in Derbyshire, who are very fond of what we're doing. They're not all of them companion students. I mean, many of them aren't. They're from soul and other traditions. But they've stayed with us as people, and they do that to help us, to support us, and to help us grow.
And I've, in fact, been on a couple or 3 of those weekends, and they're extraordinarily good.
Thank you.
Very enjoyable. Yeah. It's just a shame that the current circumstances has made it harder for us to do that kind of thing. And even though I know you're going to be doing one shortly, which I'd very much like to join, it's a bit more difficult, even for me being in the Czech Republic, to travel and
indeed,
and risk quarantine and all those sorts of things. So I'll have to wait a little longer, I think, before I join you again. But I very much look forward to it. If you could say what you would like to see the school become, would it be different? Would it be bigger? Would it be structured more, with more leadership, or do you want it to remain the way that it is, essentially?
I would love it to be bigger, as long as it didn't sacrifice the quality, but it could only be bigger to a certain extent. I often go back to what Gurdjieff said about schools, esoteric schools of the soul, come into being when they are needed, and then having had their life, they disappear. I think that's just a perfect example of what nature and the higher forces of nature do. Doesn't mean the individuals disappear, nor does it mean that I have a vision of the silent eye disappearing. It's not like that. It's simply that I accept this is not about marketing. It is about a degree of awareness of people, of what we do. And the three of us try to do that by having a very active online blogging life. But beyond that, it is, you have to believe, and we do, in the power of the Spirit to bring people to you. I didn't understand this at all. If we've gone back 15 years, I didn't understand this at all. And I was forever trying to get a mork to be more marketing aware. But to a certain extent, I've pulled away from that so I can learn more about the depths of what I and we are teaching. So I'm well aware of the power of marketing, but I'm also well aware of its pitfalls. We can only handle so many people in the shape that we're currently in.
And what's the structure of the course?
It's a 3-degree pattern, which I think was adopted by most esoteric schools over the past 20, 30 years. So it takes 3 years, as opposed to, the MOOC courses, which were fabulous, but they could take 10, 15 years for you to get through those courses. So this one takes 3 years. And there are 12 core lessons. So it's one a month. It's one lesson a month. And they are purchased at the cost of £15 a lesson now, and that's it. I mean, that apart from the workshops is our only income. We do constantly subsidise the school, and obviously as the founder, I carry the burden of doing that, and I'm happy to do that.
For those that are listening, they probably don't know that there's 3 of you running the school together.
Yes.
Perhaps it would be good for you just to sort of talk about the other 2 individuals and what strengths you think they bring to the school.
Right. Well, Sue Vincent and myself were the ones that, once I'd left Sol and began to give it shape, then Sue came to join me. So Sue is ex-Sol, and prior to that, she had created her own Tree of Life courses, her own Qabalah courses. So she knew what it took to teach people. I think she was very effective within Sol. So Sue has a terrific past. She's a great ritualist. She really is a great ritualist. And she makes some of the world's best costumes.
Yes.
Which is really important when the 3 of you are piloting something like Gilgamesh, which was Stuart France's creation last year, which was absolute epic and emotionally exhausting to act and to ritualize. But we did. And I was hoping somebody else would take the lead. For the past few workshops, I've been trying to produce rather than star in. I really did want to keep on doing that, but there was nobody else. Stuart was going to do it himself, but he said no. He said it's going to be wrong if the author steps into that. So I offered to do it, and it was a cracker. But as everybody will tell you who was there, it was absolutely exhausting for everybody concerned. But it was supposed to be. The journey of Gilgamesh is a series of initiations. Initiations which burn and collapse his life, his outer life, at the same time as sowing the seeds of greatness for an inner life. Stuart and I were Rosicrucians together. So Stuart used to come across to Manchester to our office, to our Rosicrucian meetings. So we've known each other a long, long time. And we persuaded Stu, to come and join Sue and myself a few months into setting up the Silent Eye. And he thought about it for a while. And to be honest, I didn't think he would, because I had tried to get him to take an office in a morgue, and he said he wasn't ready at that point, and he didn't want to do it. So I didn't think he'd want to do anything like that. But Sue came back and said, no, I've talked to him, and he does. And so the 3 of us then went forward into the Song of the Troubadour, which was the first workshop in 2013, and the rest is history. Really, we just kept going. We are very different people, I've got to say. You wouldn't necessarily put the 3 of us together in a room, but that difference works, I think, to our advantage. It's not an easy ride, because none of us are particularly easy with the other, and that sounds. I don't mean that sound harsh. It's not like that at all. We are very different people, and we often see from different perspectives. So there is a healthy and lively constant debate about what we do next and the way we do it. But all of that evaporates the minute we turn up and do something. And then the old magic, and this is real magic as far as I'm concerned. Then that magic happens, and something just enters, a presence just enters the vehicle, the emotional and spiritual and intellectual vehicle that you've created with the event, and boom, off she goes.
Been there, seen it.
You've seen it, yes, thankfully.
So thank you for joining us on this new episode of The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. Thanks to Steve Tanham for spending some time with me. I hope you found it enjoyable and useful. If you'd like to find out more about Steve and the Silent Eye, please look below the podcast at the podcast notes, where you'll find plenty of information both about him, the school, the Silent Eye, and the blogging activities of him and his colleagues, Stu France and Sue Vincent. You could also find a podcast, episode 2, where I talk to Sue Vincent about connecting with the land. If you enjoy this podcast, please do support it. You can do that by liking this episode, by sharing it on social media, and if you feel so inclined, you can support us on Patreon with a small donation. My name's G. Michael Vasey. I'd like to thank you for listening. Goodbye.